very glad to have you all here today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here for our whole conference, as a matter of fact. We've really enjoyed it, and we're going to enjoy it much more after this panel's over, and I'll be able to rest and relax a little bit. But we still have some business to take care of, and we're very excited to have this panel here today to talk about economic development Texas style. There's really two approaches, you think, to economic development in the country these days. One is a traditional style. That's where local governments and state governments put together economic development incentive packages. They may be tax cuts, they may be subsidies, they may even be owning part of a corporation, right? As we have here in Texas. Last time I checked, was it government ownership of the means of production is what do they call that? Socialism? But anyway, those types of things, those are the traditional means of approach to economic development. But here in Texas, while we have some of that, we've really done something very different than most of the rest of the country, and it's showing up in a whole lot of different ways. Well, we call it, at the foundation, economic development Texas style. What is economic development Texas style? Well, it's just the basic things that we stand for at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's lower regulation, it's less taxes, it's less government involvement in the economy. It's a substantial, robust, but limited tort reform system. And it's not relying on the federal government for money and for programs and those types of things. It's basically letting people do business, and that is what's bringing business to Texas. That's why Texas, since 2001, has blown away the rest of the country when it comes to economic development. Let's look at jobs, for instance. Since 2001, in the entire United States, they've had basically, essentially, 0% job growth. It's about 0.65%, something like that. But essentially, in the last 12, 13 years, 0% job growth in the entire United States. Here in Texas, 16%. What that means is that all the job growth in the United States for the last 10 or 12 years has occurred in Texas. That's an amazing statistic. And you can't just explain that away. They like to try it, Paul Krugman and others, they like to pretend like there's no Texas miracle. But the reason they try and do that is because they don't like the Texas model. They don't like economic development Texas style. What else have we seen here in Texas? It's not just about jobs, it's about GDP growth, it's about income growth, it's about population growth. Fortune 500 companies, Texas #2 in the United States. We're one of the best states. We are the best state, according to one ranking firm, to do business in. Startup businesses, we're #4 in the country. And it spreads throughout all areas of the economy. Minority business ownership, we're ranked #11th in the entire country. It happens for everybody, economic development Texas style. Finally, I'll just point out that we looked at some data about 2 years ago, and what that showed us that states that spend more on economic development programs, the traditional approach, they have less economic growth than other states that spend less. They have more economic growth. It works here in Texas, but we're here to talk about, is there a balance on that? Does Texas have that balance? Are we spending too much on economic development programs? Or could we spend a little more, a little less? Do we need to cut taxes more, lower regulation more? That's what the panel is about today. And we have a great panel to talk about that. Our first panelist today is Senator Brian Birdwell. In June 2010, Senator Birdwell won a special election to represent the people of District 22 in the Texas Senate. He now serves as the Vice Chairman of the Higher Education Committee and the Veteran Affairs Committee. In January 2012, Senator Birdwell was appointed to the Sunset Advisory Commission, and he's done some great work on there, by the way. He's really helped us in the area of electricity regulation, and also to the Joint Interim Committee to Study Human Trafficking. Please join me in welcoming Senator Brian Birdwell.
Thank you, Bill. I don't know if you had the senator go first because, quote, I'm the senator. I was hoping I would sit on the far right and be last, not just mainly because of the far right aspect as opposed to the last aspect. Bill told us that we had a few moments, and I'll emphasize that the rules of engagement are always the same whenever you stand up and speak to a group of people. Be good, be brief, be gone. So I'll do my best not to not to take too long. There are, I guess the key question, let's go back to basic first foundational principles. What's the proper role and function of government? When people talk about being liberal, conservative, those are adjectives in relationship to what? They're adjectives in relationship to the limits that are placed on government. And we as conservatives want to conserve the limits placed on government. Liberals wish to remove the constraints placed on government to be more active. It's the difference between passivity versus activity. And I think that's the proper philosophy that Texas has brought. And so from a perspective of how do we compete with other states in the nation, it's from a lack of activity rather than an abundance of activity that has made Texas so successful. Now there's some areas in the state that which I do have concern with how we do some of the economic incentives. When we talk about creating an environment in the state of Texas for economic activity, what does everybody enjoy when you create an environment? It applies to all. But when you're doing things from an activity perspective that chooses winners and losers in a particular economic program, now government has stepped forward and has now decided that in using that monopoly of force that it has called law, it will decide who's the winner, who's the loser, and the like. As an example, in our movie, Texas Moving Image Industry program, one of the things, I read one of the paragraphs that talks about what the program does. In fact, it came from TCCRI. Texas Conservative Coalition Research Institute recommended that the legislature should repeal the incentive for the motion picture industry and instead provide one for the software developers. What did TCCRI do? They chose a winner and a loser. The proper role and function is to set the environment for all, and if Texas happens to bring movie producers here because Texas in general is a good environment, as opposed to specifically taking that monopoly of force and choosing an industry that we wish to favor by taking from taxpayers with that monopoly of force to give to a certain sector of industry, that is a problem. And so when you look at how our economic incentives are laid out, look at the Emerging Technology Fund. One of the things that came from the governor's website, it says that the state utilizes taxpayer funds to make an investment in privately owned entrepreneurial businesses. Regardless of whether the business fails or not, whether that commodity is a good one to chase, what is the foundational concern we have with that statement? It's that government will use its monopoly of force, the force of law, to take from taxpayers and then chooses which industry, which market to actively use those dollars, setting an environment for everybody to succeed or fail of their own accord, of their own market strategies, of their own talents, is that proper role and function. But actively choosing by using that monopoly of force to take from the taxpayer and then choosing, that begs a question. And here's the question I think it begs. It begs the incrementalism question of where do you stop? When you look at Texas's economic incentive programs, the TEF, the Enterprise Fund, was developed or authorized in 2003. In 2005, the Emergency Technology Fund was authorized. In 2007, the Movie Fund went from being a voluntarily one done by individuals that donated to it to the legislature now providing dollars to it. What's happened? Once you cross the threshold that says government has an active role in choosing, you've now gone down the incremental path that says, okay, we did this in 2003, the next step is this in 2005, the next step is this in 2007. Where do you stop? Once you accept the premise that government should choose one over another, as opposed to creating an environment that applies to all, that's where I think Texas has to be very, very careful to not go down the road of incrementalism that now says government is the best place to choose the private investment of tax dollars in what government chooses is the best place, as opposed to the individual marketplace. And I look forward to those discussions and listening to the other panel members. Thank you, Bill, for the opportunity to join y'all. It's been a real treat.
Thank you, Senator Birdwell. Appreciate it. Our next speaker today is Representative Jim Murphy. Representative Murphy represents District 133 in the city of Houston, and he serves on the committees of small business and economic development and higher education, and is the chairman of the subcommittee on manufacturing. His legislative work has been recognized by the National Coalition for Capital, Texas Right to Life, and the Texas Association of Business. Please join me in welcoming Representative Jim Murphy.
Thank you, Bill. Kind of halfway in your lap here. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you, TPPF, for involving me. And Senator, it's great to follow you because I think you've really laid the predicate, and I appreciate that. And you should go first. I like being seated. Please note this in your Twitter feeds. I am to the right of Senator Birdwell. So really appreciate that. Bill and I were talking about this Texas miracle. And where does this Texas miracle come from? And what we're faced with today and what we're going to talk about and have a real adult conversation is about how do we keep it going and how does it come about? We're not going to determine our final answers today. This is part of an ongoing conversation, and Jazz, hope there'll be a lot more research as we do this because we wish we knew all our programs worked as well as they were envisioned to work when we adopted them. And there are a bunch of them. And so we're going to come back and talk about some of those specifically. But I want you guys to understand, it's my commitment, and I hope yours as well, to keep working through this because there's a lot of moving parts here. And not all incentives are created equal. I mean, there are some that are very different in nature and in practice than others. And it's easy to pick out the bad ones and say, gosh, who would ever approve that? Then maybe you find out there's a story behind it perhaps, but there are some excellent ones that are critical to our economy that have worked and are working quite well. But I do want to talk about this miracle aspect. It's very important to me. And when we talk about the Texas miracle, I want you to know, as a good practicing Catholic, I could give a real talk about how miracles evidence God's work in this world today. But that would kind of take us in a different, very valid theological manner, but I think away from our answer. But we talk about how to maintain that miracle with sound business principles, so they work for businesses, and sound conservative principles. So there are things that we can tell our taxpayers, that they make sense. We're coming back here in a year. In a year, we'll be in session, moving all this forward. So we need to think about what we do to make it happen. Well, what the Texas miracle has really been undergirded by and what's brought about by, I like the definition of when the definition of luck is when preparation meets opportunity, right? So a lot of people think Texas is very, very lucky, and that's not the case at all. We have made hard decisions, good decisions over many years, largely dealing with the conditions that businesses are going to operate in Texas. And so, we stand on the shoulder of those that came before us. And as the Senator talked about, when you do these broad-based things that address conditions, you do things that help big business, small business, entrepreneurial businesses, all parts of the state. And that's really where I think we will have our greatest impact and have. First off, low taxes. We are a low-tax state. Absolutely true. But if you drill down into it, and I'm pleased to have had a time serving on Ways and Means before I served in economic development, is when it comes to businesses, we're really not a low-tax state. We're about average. And if you're a business with large capital assets, we're actually kind of a high-tax state. So it depends who you are. On an individual basis, hoorah, and I'm glad, Senator, it's in the Texas Constitution because we'd be tempted to mess with it. There is no personal income tax. And that helps us when we're recruiting high-end wage earners to come to Texas. And let me parenthetically say, my day job is in commercial real estate, so I work a lot on relocation. So I've had a lot of dialogue, a lot of experience over a lot of years with different industries. And when you talk to the principal, you talk about what housing costs are in Texas and what their, after-tax wages are going to be. It's powerful. When they look at their company's bottom line, sometimes they have a little pause. So I want to come back to that. Secondly, we've had, as Bill mentioned, significant changes to our legal structure in terms of tort reform that have removed, in a large sense, risk for businesses. Businesses are risk averse. You tell them whatever a tax level is, and they can do the math to make it happen. If you say it's plus or minus this, then everything kind of falls apart. And so that has helped Texas, I think, tremendously. It's not just in business. It's also helped out our medical community significantly, is we now have a lot more doctors coming to Texas. I'm concerned. I don't know if you know, but one of Bobby Jindal's messages yesterday, including do a nice little message to my son who's playing football in Louisiana. A little separate story there, but he's here to find out how he did tort reform. I want to underscore the competitive nature of economic development. Right now, we can say to businesses, particularly in the petrochem industry, hey, forget Louisiana, Texas, we've got that tort reform. Once Louisiana puts that on the table, where are we? Our regulatory environment in Texas, we pride ourselves on it being fair and predictable, and it is. But like so many of you, I'm concerned about the continued and concerted overreaching by the federal government as they seem to intrude on our sovereignty and our success here in Texas. So, we're all going to be fine, but in some cases, we aren't in charge. Not until Greg Abbott sues them again and we prevail. So glad we have the Attorney General we do. In fact, he's our lunch speaker, so I'll talk about that. The fourth thing I want to point out that our predecessors have done for us largely is make our transportation system best in the nation. I'm talking about not just roads, but rail and barge and ship. All these things are part of the world of logistics. And so those of you playing the game where you have to name the various words when tic-tac-toe, you can mark your logistics square at this point. But companies in Texas are competing globally. And so moving stuff in and out of Texas, critically important. We made some big progress last session on infrastructure, but there is a lot more to be done. And we've got to figure out how to do that before our growth, our wonderful growth, becomes a problem for us. I would mention a couple other things that I think are part of that, things that make things work for everyone. And that is our higher education system is still very strong. Some work to be done there. Our right to work laws, critically important, particularly when we talk about recruiting companies from the Northeast. And just sort of the Texas attitude of it doesn't matter who your daddy was. If you want to get to work here, we're glad to have you. And I think that's something that people notice. So all these conditions benefit all businesses. But when you talk about keeping us growing or keeping us booming as we are today, you got to ask, well, what about incentives? Are they part of this? And the answer is absolutely. So the data you heard about all our growth since 2001, I think we're mentioning, has occurred in a time where we have incentives. Now, let's talk about those for a minute. You'll hear this conversation of either or. Well, either we have good government, and that should be enough, or we just throw government out the window and have incentives, and that'll do the trick. And I think it's like asking a team if they want to have good offense or good defense. You really want to have both. And I think we can in Texas. That is a harder challenge than the either-or world. And for those of us who live in the real world and have to pass these laws, that's kind of where we are. I don't think anybody, in my experience, has moved to a place that had bad infrastructure or high taxes because they got an incentive. That just has not happened. But a couple points I would make about incentives. First off, in some cases, I'm talking about one in particular, they address real shortcomings, disparities, or inequities, and I'll talk about one in our tax code. And this is the Chapter 313 agreements. I think, Brandon, you can talk about those a little bit?
A little bit, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And Brandon was very much involved in the work creating that initially. But when I talk about Texas being a high tax state for businesses, the 313 agreements, which are a temporary limitation of your property taxes, have a lot to do with that. Well, this past session, we reauthorized them. And so we made a whole series of changes to 313s to make them a little more palatable and understood in the sense of one of the things you have to do now is demonstrate competitive siting to secure your 313 agreement. We have to know there's actually competition. We don't want you to say, I'm thinking about Ontario. We want, well, what evidence do you have of that? And so Rick knows. We talked about this. We want to know, are we really in a game here, or are we just bidding against ourselves? That's a real estate term we use. You don't want to bid against yourself. So we want to make sure that there's actually competition. And the second thing is we're now testing the scale of the abatement to say, well, okay, you're bringing in jobs and payroll taxes and hotel taxes and sales taxes, but here's our tax abatement over here. Is it a whole lot more? Are we paying a higher price than we should pay for these jobs? And so now we have that math available to us. We think this program is working tremendously well. The data on it is incredibly compelling. But I'm here to tell you, as a member of the committee now for 2 sessions on economic development, and all these abatements come through us or Ways and Means, we're really not sure. 313s I'm very comfortable with because I spent a large part of last session drilling down and talking to industry and working with the comptroller and the folks from the revenue group. We have so many different programs out there, you wonder if they all meet that same high standard of transparency, of scale, of competition. And so, Senator, that's where you and I think, really need to make sure we work this next session to have a larger review. I want to bring out the second element relative to these abatements and incentives in general. Abatements, I think, kind of stand separately from the incentives. And that is, and I know this sounds pretty cavalier, so here it goes, but you don't want to bring a knife to a gunfight. When Texas is competing against Louisiana or Mexico or whatever it is, other jurisdiction, and the other jurisdiction has put $1 million on the table for, say, job training, it makes it kind of hard for Texas to have a zero. Zero is not very compelling. Doesn't look like you're very interested. If it's a $500 million program, you say to me, well, Jim, why would somebody for $1 million make a $500 million decision? And the answer is because they're people. They're not machines. And they have to answer to executives and stockholders and the media. And so in some cases, Texas just sort of needs to be at the table and in the game, not matching penny for penny and incentive for incentive, but to say, these are some things that are available to you in Texas. Sometimes it's just so we can make the next cut and look at all those other advantages we have of infrastructure and of our taxes and things like that. So it's not really a question of blind faith in terms of incentives, but it does require a significant amount of additional work by us with your help. And so that's why I'm delighted to be part of this panel today. I look forward to our conversations over the next year and longer, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Murphy. Our next speaker today is Matthew Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a senior research fellow and lead scholar on the project for the Study for American Capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is also an adjunct professor of economics at George Mason. He specializes in economic freedom and economic growth, public choice economics, and the economics of government favoritism. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Mitchell. I'm hoping that's going to come on over there. When you do that, let's see. It should.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bill, and thank you all for coming. I feel at a bit of a handicap coming after 2 politicians. Economists are not known for their ability to make very compelling remarks. You can tell there's an easy way to tell a extroverted economist from an introverted economist. An introverted economist will spend his whole talk looking at his shoes. An extroverted economist will spend his whole talk looking at your shoes. Being an economist, I have a little bit of a masochistic streak. And one of the things I like to do every so often, about this time of year actually, is pour through the State of the State addresses of the governors around the country. And the reason why I do this...
I just finished that myself.
All right, we've got several up here. We should form a little meeting or something. So one of the reasons why I do this is to sort of get the temperature gauge of what the states are dealing with, and it's a nice way to see the different environments. So I had to go back a couple of years, see what Governor Perry was saying, and and one of the things Governor Perry expressed in his last State of the State is that Texas is ready and able to compete with other states. Now, the interesting thing is this sentiment is found in just about every State of the State address. And this is good because governors, legislators, policymakers increasingly realize that they are in competition with every other state and indeed every other country in the world. And they are in competition for jobs, for businesses, and for tax dollars, because every new business that is created, every business that is relocated could happen here, or it could happen in my home state of New Mexico, or it could happen in Singapore. And it's an increasingly global economy, and states do need to recognize that. But there are, I would argue, broadly two different ways that states can compete. And the first is to say, we are open for competition because we have the best environment in which to do business. You come to our state and you will experience, you will find high quality services for low prices, very low taxes, limited regulations, a good tort environment, a good environment in which to do business. And one of the best ways actually to define this is by the term what economists call economic freedom. And economic freedom is, it's the characteristics of a region that have high in economic freedom are that individuals are able to choose. Most choices are based on individual choice. There's not a mandate to buy a certain product, for example. In which businesses are able to enter and compete freely. You don't have to have the right connections or you don't have to jump through a bunch of different hoops. In which goods and services are exchanged through open markets, and in which persons and property are well protected. Those are the four elements of economic freedom. And in fact, economists have spent quite a bit of time over the last several decades developing measures of economic freedom. One of the best articulations of competing by providing a best economic environment is by Governor Rick Scott of Florida. I hasten to add that Florida is no better at this than many other states, but he does have a nice way of saying it. And the way that the governor put it is the best thing government can do to create a level playing field for all competitors, and then to get out of the way so that they can compete. What we can do is to continue to put Florida companies in a position to outcompete companies in all other states and countries. So economists have been measuring economic freedom. What are the results? Well, this is an international comparison. It's a study conducted actually by one of the professors is Bob Lawson here from Texas. And what the authors did is they rate each of the countries according to their level of economic freedom. How intrusive are taxes? How intrusive are regulations? How well protected is property? What's the state of the rule of law? All of those things. And as you move further right on the scale, you get to countries that are more and more free. And as you move further north on the scale, up on the scale, that's the level of per capita production. And this is essentially the best measure economists have for how prosperous people are. And as you can see, there's a very strong positive upward sloping trend. If you do much social science, you know that a picture like this is actually very rare. This is an extraordinarily strong, statistically significant relationship. Places that are more free are more prosperous. You can see it through the chart. You can also see it if you do more sophisticated econometric studies that try to control for other countervailing factors. You don't have to go through and do all the studies because tons and tons and tons of them have been done. In fact, this is one of the most studied phenomenon in the social sciences. You don't have to read all these papers because somebody else has. And I'm going to put up their review of it. In a recent study looking at 52 separate studies of economic freedom and growth, the authors found that regardless of the sample of the countries, the measure of economic freedom, or the level of aggregation, there's a solid finding of a direct positive association between economic freedom and growth. This is a very important and key ingredient to prosperity. We have measures of economic freedom that are also done across states. Mercatus has one. The Fraser Institute has another. Other organizations, Tax Foundation, ALEC, there's several different measures of economic freedom across the states. Most of them point in the same direction. And sure enough, across state level analyses, you see the same sort of pattern. If you look at average economic freedom in the 2000s, and compare it with real economic growth, there is, again, a positive and statistically significant relationship. Those states that are more free enjoy higher levels of growth. And there you can see Texas. It's one of the more economically free states, and it is also one of the more prosperous states. This is not a coincidence. The authors of the Mercatus study offer some advice, and they say that to policymakers interested in attracting new residents and businesses, we'd recommend measures to increase freedom and reduce the cost of living. But there is another way that states can compete. And this is with targeted incentives that basically say we're not worrying about our environment at all. We're trying to make sure that we let the environment be what it is. We're going to suspend the rules for particular firms or industries. So most states are relatively transparent about it, and you can go to their websites. In Texas, you can look at the Economic Development website, and you can read about the Texas Enterprise Fund. You can also read about the Texas Emerging Technology Fund, and you can read about several other host of incentive packages, everything from tax abatements to outright subsidies that are designed to privilege particular firms or industries. So what's the relationship between targeted incentives and economic growth? Well, here, it's exactly the opposite. Those states that hand out more subsidies per capita actually experience slower, statistically significantly slower growth compared to those states that offer fewer subsidies. So a state like Nevada or North Dakota, states that give very few subsidies out, actually tend to experience much higher rates of economic growth compared to Arkansas or West Virginia or Texas. So I would argue that these types of targeted incentives are really just one aspect of ways that government can privilege particular firms or industries. We all know about the bailouts, and most conservatives and libertarians recognize the bailouts as an affront to economic freedom and to free markets. But there's all sorts of other ways that government can intervene on behalf of and privilege particular firms or industries. There are regulations that privilege some firms, there are subsidies, there are tax credits, there's grants of monopoly. And all of these things, I would argue, set off a set of pathological problems for an economy. So for one thing, they tend to undermine competition. When you privilege particular firms or industries, that means it tends to monopolize certain industries, and that leads to higher prices and lower quality goods. It also means that firms invest time, money, and resources in asking for privileges. Well-paid lobbyists, lawyers, accountants, these are very, very smart and productive people who could be thinking of new ways to create value for customers. Instead, they are spending their resources trying to come up with new ways to obtain privileges from government, and that's a waste, economically speaking. So it's estimated that between $1 and $3.5 trillion annually is spent in the business of seeking privileges. So to give you a perspective on this, this is somewhere between the size of the stimulus that we got and the stimulus that Paul Krugman thinks we should have had. It's a big cost, right? It also means that talent is misallocated. So rather than individuals going to school and learning how to become engineers and learning how to become customer representatives and focusing on the customer, they're going to school to learn how to obtain privileges. This has a subtle and long-term impact on economic growth because it changes the allocation of talent. There's a relatively famous study a few years ago where they looked at the allocation of talent, and they found that in those places where people are a higher percentage of the population is in the business of seeking privilege, they tend to grow slower. How much slower? It's about 0.78% slower growth per year. So you can say 0.78%. That sounds like something we could handle, right? That's relatively minimal. Well, let's go back to 1985. This is actual per capita growth for the United States over the last 40 years. Now let's go back to 1985 and see what would have happened if, starting then, we had grown at 0.78% slower or faster. Well, it turns out our per capita production would be $54,000 rather than $42,000 per person. It's a huge difference. What's that little dip at the end on the solid blue line? Anybody know? It's a Great Recession, right? It's the most calamitous economic event in any of our lives, and it pales in comparison to slower growth due to privilege seeking and privilege granting. There's another problem, is that governments are not particularly effective at figuring out what the next big business is going to be. As Larry Summers, President Obama's economic advisor, told the president, government makes for a very crappy venture capitalist. It turns out government is not particularly effective at this, and you can see this in the housing business. We spent over a decade through taxes and regulations and subsidies systematically privileging housing and housing-related sectors. It turns out that that the government was trying to encourage people to build more houses in Florida and Nevada than people wanted to build, and they called it wrong. And it turns out it was a house of cards. A sustainable path of business, a sustainable path of economic growth is built around customer desires, not around what politicians think is going to be the next big thing. Real quick, I know my time is just about up. The other thing is that it tends to undermine the legitimacy of business and government. So it's very difficult to find an objective way to hand out privileges. So what often ends up happening is privileges are handed out to well-connected firms. And it turns out, if you look at in the run-up to TARP, those firms that lobbied more and engaged in more political activity, every $1 invested in lobbying was associated with $486 to $585 extra dollars in TARP. There's actually a 1 down there. You can't even see it. It's a big return on investment, right? Well, this undermines the legitimacy of capitalism. People start to think that this is what capitalism is about. In no place in the world is crony capitalism further along than in Italy. And Luigi Zingales, an Italian economist, points out that in Italy, a recent survey of business people found that the most important determinant of Italian success in business is knowledge of influential people. 80% of them said that. Focus on customer, hard work, those are things like 4, 5, 6 down in the list, right? So it doesn't just undermine business, but it also undermines legitimacy of government as well. I always like to end with a quote from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, because it's George Mason who wrote this. And he said, no man or set of men are entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public services. This is a basic feature of our Republican government. Government should exist to promote the general welfare, not the specific welfare of particular firms or industries. My colleague, Maurice McTeague, is a little bit more pithy. He says the best economic development program is not to need one. If you have a targeted economic development program, and it's an admission of failure. It's an admission that your environment is not one that will attract businesses on its own, and that you have to suspend the rules in order to attract businesses. So with that, I'm going to just point you to, if you want to learn more, go to the Mercatus website, check out our research areas and the study of American capitalism. There you can find a lot of resources and studies. We will actually have a couple of studies in the next few weeks to months on state economic development and targeted incentives. Put up my contact information. Love to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me get this set up real quick. All right. Our final speaker today is Brandon Agamalian. Brandon Agamalian is an expert in local government, transportation, economic development, property tax, and cultural arts issues. He has set up and manages a local government advocacy practice group, Focus Advocacy, and he has spent much time representing local governments before the Texas legislature. Please join me in welcoming Brandon Agamalian.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, TPPF, and it's an honor to be here today. Happy New Year to everybody. This is a good-looking group, by the way. It's been fun to sit up here and listen to the smart comments and to look out at this audience. I love Matt's presentation. It's very in line with what my mother believes of my career as well. I am a misallocation of talent and an economic waste, and she has made that very clear to me. So today's question: what works best in attracting jobs? This is our panel description, our forum here today: the traditional economic development programs, tax breaks and subsidies, or the Texas model. In the Texas miracle: less regulation, lower taxes, tort reform, all that good stuff. My answer is C, neither. Really, my answer is D. It's all of the above, and it's more. You can tell here that I failed a lot of tests in school because I kept making up answers. I want to note that we talk here about attracting jobs, and jobs are not the end-all, be-all of measuring economic development success and measuring the success of policies. Investment, in my opinion and in my experience, can be just as critical. It's something I spend a lot of time talking to legislators about. I've talked with Representative Murphy a lot about that over the years. We want investment sometimes more than we want jobs. Jobs bring people, and people bring expense to government. Generally speaking, we don't pay our own way in terms of what we cost government. And so sometimes the best deal for Texas can be the multi-million or multi-billion-dollar investment with very few jobs. I want to pull the camera back a little bit and remind everybody, and I know everybody in the room knows this, but our Texas success story and Texas miracle are largely and has been largely built on the back of other factors. We have fantastic weather here for business purposes. We have fantastic geography that God blessed Texas with, centrally located, really globally centrally located, but certainly centrally located within the country. On a ocean, so we have ports. We've got a ton of federal highways, thanks to LBJ and other predecessors. We have a tremendous quality of life in Texas, fantastic urban centers, great high school football and barbecue and pretty women, oil and gas resources and other tremendous natural resources that, again, God bless Texas with, including wind. And we've got an abundance of cheap and relatively affordable land. At least that's what I'm told. I can't afford any of it. Nonetheless, it is, I'm told by the experts, affordable. One of the greatest things we have in this state are great airports. The success of the Metroplex is built on the back of DFW Airport, and that's just a fact. If it wasn't for that economic engine, and the ability to move goods and resources and people out of DFW the way that we can and the magnitude and the volume that we can due to its size. And I love that about Texas, that we just build things bigger and then we succeed from that. That airport and the airports in Houston and other parts of the state are critical. The right to work state and no personal income tax. These are all things that have contributed a lot to our success. Historically, and I titled this Study Your History, when times were good in the 70s and the 90s, when I first started wandering around the Capitol, Texas had a very arrogant attitude, to be honest, about it. It was predicated more on this. It was, we're the best, we got it all, we don't need to do much, do we? And we didn't have a lot of programs. In the late 1990s, leading up to the turn of the century, we started slipping and suffering, and most of our factors and most of the things that we could look to suggested that. Between 97 and 2001, we only landed 2 projects valued at more than $500 million in investment. To put that in context, in the previous 7 years before that, we averaged 2 per year of that magnitude. We were losing investment to other states, we were losing jobs to other states, and it was due primarily to our tax structure and the lack of economic development tools. In reaction to that, one of many things that the legislature did and that we did as a state was to pass Chapter 313, House Bill 1200, which Representative Murphy mentioned. Since that time, since 2001, that piece of legislation alone has helped attract 100 new, and I should use the word mega projects. This law is only for investments of $100 million or more. In many cases, it's $1 billion. In some cases, it's multiple billions when you're talking about the chemical factories and the chip plants. And the chip plants don't have to locate here. In fact, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to locate here at times. And they've come here to some degree because of this program and other factors. 6,000 new jobs in Texas, $47 billion in investment under House Bill 1200, Chapter 313 agreements, and still going. And I applaud Representative Murphy and the legislature for its work, but Jim in particular for his work on Chapter 313 and improving that program. And I'll come back to that in a minute about those very improvements. So I think we've accepted the paradigm that Texas has a valid and necessary role to play in economic development. What we really have to do is meet the market. I appreciate Matt's presentation very much, and I'm always fascinated by economists and their work. I find it very interesting. And maybe in another life, I may have studied that very kind of thing more formally. But what I ended up was being somebody that helped deals come together. And that's really what economic development policy is about for me personally and in my involvement in the legislature. It's about making a deal work. We've got to meet the market, and we're not in control of the market. We're just not. Government's not. It's not supposed to be. We're not in control as a Texas legislature of what other states are doing and what other countries are doing across the world. This last point I really want to emphasize to you because it was touched on a little bit by Representative Murphy, but the bottom line nature of business decisions has become more pointed and increasingly more important during the time that I've been messing with this stuff. I call it Wall Street stuff. Quarterly earnings alone and bottom line stock prices can turn these decisions on a dime, and there's nothing we can do about that. I've been a part of projects where we had everything lined up. They were ready to go. We had permitted, we had site selection, we'd put the incentives on the table, sign, seal, deliver. They don't meet their quarterly earnings on Wall Street, project dies. Nothing you can do about it. It is a very bottom line world increasingly to corporate America. There is also a fiduciary duty that these companies have that I think we sometimes misunderstand or don't emphasize enough. Their investors and their stockholders expect them to go get the best deal that they can. And if they don't, if they're negligent about that, in fact, if they're purposely negligent about that, that puts them in a very precarious legal position with their investors. Other states are going to offer this stuff. Other countries are going to offer this stuff. We've got to go meet the market, and companies are expected to go out there and shop for this kind of stuff. The decision to offer or not offer incentives, I think at the end of the day, it can't be made in a vacuum. It certainly, in my humble opinion, can't be made in an ideological vacuum. We have to be very real world about this. I know when we started to ramp up in the legislature in the 1990s and in early 2000s with economic development policy, and we really started getting sophisticated, we all said this time and time again, we'd like to not offer these incentives. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to offer these incentives. I remember Governor Perry talking about that when he was the lieutenant governor at the time. But we don't live in a perfect world. And if we were to take an ideological approach, or try to look at this through a very pure lens and say we think this retards the market, we think that this puts undue influence and picks winners and losers, I think that would be a detrimental decision to Texas. And I think that everybody else in the nation and in the world wishes that we would make that kind of decision because it would be to our detriment. My mother taught me balance is the key. And it was touched on earlier, and it's really what this panel is about. And I just love these discussions and appreciate y'all hosting this. These are very, very critical discussions. And I think that's the answer here. We've got to have balance. My experience has taught me that it's tough to make a deal come together in the real world, and that there are so many factors that put these business deals together. These incentives, which is really just generally a fancy word for tax liabilities, generally speaking, they're just one of dozens of factors that drive these decisions. And that's why I think it's best to have balance and to follow my mom's advice. I wanted to just, I'm not going to go through this, but I wanted to give everybody a quick taste, and you'll note my footnote at the bottom. This is not any kind of comprehensive listing, but when we talk about economic development as a broad term, there are a lot of programs out there, and they're not always just about tax incentives, but many of them are. This is a listing of a number of programs that the Workforce Commission, the Comptroller, TCEQ, the Governor's Office has. These are local programs that cities and economic development corporations and counties administer. Workforce training and job training programs, and something I know Senator Birdwell has worked on in his time in the legislature. I think this is a critical area that the legislature really needs to focus on. I think it's the next big, really the future of being successful. And then Representative Murphy talked about infrastructure as well as being a critical part of the economic development picture. And these are a number of financial programs that we offer in water and transportation. At the end of the day, and in closing, I think to have a successful economic development program, it needs to be one that is primarily driven through local control, that these decisions are made locally and they're made by elected officials that are accountable. It needs to be a transparent process. The taxpayers need to understand what they're getting themselves into and what their elected officials are getting themselves into. We need to focus on capital investment and job creation and economic diversity. We don't want to have all our eggs in one basket. We did that in the 1980s with oil and gas, and we paid for it dearly. We need to attract as many different industries as we can in Texas. It needs to be a fair system, and we need to measure it. And our taxpayers need to demand that. We need to know what the results are, what kind of return on investment we got. If we follow these principles and stay true to the conservative values of this state, then we'll be successful, and we'll also protect the taxpayer. So at the end of the day, I caution everybody, while our overall system may not be perfect, it is something we can take a lot of pride in, the success that we've had. Let's take a balanced and realistic and cautious approach to tinkering with this very successful model. I think I've gone a little long, and I apologize. I love talking about this stuff, and look forward to some questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Brandon. We do have a little bit of time since we ran over from the previous panel. We're going to take a little extra time here. Just wanted to ask the folks on the panel if you had any comments based on what you've heard the panelists talk about before we go to the audience. Anything?
I have a comment.
Okay.
Senator Birdwell mentioned something, and this I'm just going to point something out that I think is interesting. You talk about, I think you said socialism when government owns business. Or is invested in business.
Well, Bill said that, but I agree. Yes.
Or Bill, no, you're right. You're right. It was Bill. I'm sorry.
I think somebody else said that before me too.
I tend to agree with that. And I wanted to point out that at the General Land Office under current law right now, we have a program that allows the state of Texas to maintain ownership in private businesses, and then in fact to tell local governments that because the state owns this business, that local laws don't apply to it, that zoning in particular doesn't apply to it. And that's something that I'm concerned about, particularly as a local government advocate and somebody that generally agrees with that philosophy of government shouldn't be in the business of owning businesses. That's a program that I hope we'll take a look at in the next legislative session.
Good, good. All right. Questions from the audience? Go right ahead.
Yes. My question is for Mr. Mitchell. The Mercatus Center. I'd like to know how they measure economic freedom and what effect it would have on that measure on the overall score of a state or a country that through its legislature or Congress or official government body has decreed that it is the government of that land is above the law. It can destroy a person's business, take their property, admit that it did so in violation of the Constitution and laws, and then say, but you know what, we're above the law. They call it sovereign immunity. So we don't owe any restitution to the victim. What effect would that have on that country and the perception of the world of their economic freedom for the citizens that live in that land?
It's a great question. So first, I guess I'd separate it into actual economic freedom and measured economic freedom. So in terms of actual economic freedom, unquestionably, that would be an extreme violation of economic freedom. It's easier to think about and define actual economic freedom than it is to actually measure it and turn it into an objective measure. But when persons and property are protected And when property can't be expropriated, and when government is constrained by the rule of law, that's where economic freedom can be found. Now trying to take that concept and measuring it is tricky. And so what we would hope is that the measures that we actually develop get at that and correctly downgrade a country or a region if it fails to live up to that standard. So in terms of the Mercatus measure, and this is true of most indices of economic freedom, the idea is you start with publicly available objective data. So they look at, in the case of Mercatus, they look at regulations and then fiscal policy. And within fiscal policy, they divide it up and look about half at taxes and half at spending. So they look at how much is spending per capita. They look at the top marginal tax rates across all different tax bases. In terms of regulations, they actually go to the code books and they see what kind of regulations are there on in the workforce, what kind of regulations are there on utilities, are prices allowed to adjust, and they measure these as broadly as possible across all the states. Now, one thing is the Mercatus measure of economic freedom, and this is true also of most of them, is it's all transparent and it's online. And if you don't like the way that they've weighted it, you can weight it a different way. So if you think that rule of law should measure way more than, say, regulation, then you can do that and you can adjust it. But it's all up on the website. Freedom in the 50 states is the Mercatus measure. So the other one that I use for the international is Fraser's, the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World, and that you can find at freetheworld.com. It's a great resource. As I said, it's been used by hundreds of peer-reviewed academic studies.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
You're listening to one of those engineers that actually started a business in its garage and turned it into an international business. And certainly we had competition, and that was something we always had to work with. But the biggest problem we had as a small business was actually government. And we closed our business 30 years ago, and since that time, I have seen more intrusion by government. And the thing that concerns me probably one of the most is the marriage of big government and big business. I see this trend here in Texas, and I'm concerned about that, and have testified in committees about that. And this next session, I hope that whenever you all meet in your committees and you establish your agendas, that you try to diminish this trend in Texas. And it's not basically a question, but basically a concern that I'd like to express to the panel. And I'd like to compliment Mr. Mitchell on his presentation. That was my experience in business very closely, and I appreciate your comments on that.
All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the panel. I hope you enjoy lunch afterwards, and join me once again in thanking the panelists today. Thanks, George. Pleasure.